And Mikhail Dashevsky also depicted the cultural life in his city, in his Moscow. He was from that circle of Moscow intelligentsia, intellectual people full of knowledge who had a big interest in life, and especially that generation of people to which Dashevsky belonged. That was a generation of people whose parents were really believers in a new revolutionary way of life after 1917. But the generation of Dashevsky and his friends, it was generation of orphans. Many of them lost parents because of the Stalin repressions and because of the Second World War. And that feeling of being orphan, of being abandoned during their childhood, that was a very strong attitude reflected in their future life. Maybe because he had no father, he felt city so deeply and sharp. He had no protection in his relations with the city, which was not easy, of course. City, big city, it's very tough. But at the same time, the relations what Dashevsky constructed with the city, it was a relation of the child adores city as a family. I can say Dashevsky was adopted by the city, and he feels it as a big family, a big house, where he was able to review every tiny detail and try to understand these details. And to return back to the topic of cultural life in Moscow, there is an image about the loss of hopes of revolution. The image done after USSR was collapsed. The image done from the arch with the bookstore, with some signs with 1917 in the window, because it's November and it's time when Soviet Revolution was celebrated and still celebrated in Russia. And in the right side of the image you can see the bust of Mayakovsky, great Russian poet of 20th century. And Mayakovsky is watching the building of KGB. It's in very center of Moscow, in few blocks from the native area of Dashevsky. So that's the front of this monument to great poet, and it looks very static, very brutal, but you can see a tiny chien, a tiny pet in front of this big head. And for you it might look like just an obvious Moscow city streets plot, but for Dashevsky, because he's a man of books, such plot was amazing, a kind of magic situation, because this pet is exact that breed what Mayakovsky had and adores. And for Dashevsky, to review this situation, It was like to review the meeting of poet and his dog once again. And of course, to recognize such tiny stories, you have to be inside of the history of culture. Otherwise, it will look very obvious. And Dashevsky in 60s visited many evenings of poetry. That was very important part of the public cultural life in the city. And this image, the portrait of Russian poet Andrei Voznesensky, was done in theater on Taganka when this young poet performed in the beginning of performance after his poems. So he wrote a piece of poem, and then actors came on the stage and started to read other parts of his poem. And it was a unity of people around the words, around the rhythm of the words. And 60s, it was really an epoch, a decade of poetry in Russian culture. 60s named the Thaw because in culture it was a period of renaissance, a period of thaw after the cold years of Stalin epoch. And this important direction in Russian culture was fixed by the film Lenin's Gate, directed by Marlen Khutsiev in 1962. For example, there is a stage from the film. 4 poets are sitting at the stage reading their poems to the public. And that was very important for the cultural life. People wanted to sit to hear the poems. People wanted to be part of this big society of contemporaries living with the right words. And for example, there is a quote from the memoirs by Andrei Voznesensky, that poet who was depicted by Dashevsky. And it's a story how this film, Lenin's Gate, was produced when the real poets, the real people from the street, from Moscow, they were filmed for cinema Lenin's Gate. So in the film you can see the pieces of documentary actually. And these things were done in this room. It's an old building of Polytechnic Museum in Moscow. And it's interesting because this room had a very long poetic history in Russia. Since very beginning, this room was used for evenings of poetry. Pasternak, Mayakovsky, Tsvetaeva, Akhmatova, in different times, they were the guests of this lecture hall, and they read their poems for public in this room. Another thing, strange thing, unbelievable thing, the performance of Senegal Ballet Group in Moscow, 1917. Dashevsky was on one of those performances, and he depicted the dances on the stage. And when we exhibited these images 2 years ago in Museum of Moscow, we had very strange reaction from public. Some people told, "Oh, it was impossible. How the women with naked breast danced in Moscow in that time? It's a lie. It can't be." Other people told, "Yes, those events had a place, but it was nothing strange. We listened jazz, we danced contemporary dancing, the same as in other countries, and of course, we were able to watch contemporary performances." A lot of stereotypes about Soviet culture can be destroyed when you review such images. But at the same time, for many people, still it's absolutely unbelievable and unusual. And I remember some visitors of the exhibition in Moscow 2 years ago, they complained of these images. For them, these images were images with naked bodies, so you should cover. That's not possible to show in public place. It means in Russia still we have a mix of different cultures in the same time. Mixture of culture of intellectuals and culture of people of rules and restrictions. And these people hardly live together. But at the same time, that's what we name the contemporary Russian society. And there is an image by another Moscow photographer of the same generation as Mikhail Dashevsky, Elena Glazacheva. And here you can see a kind of bitter context of relations of African dancers and public in the room. And Dashevsky also depicted the changes of the life in Russia through the monuments in the city. You see 3 monuments of Lenin in one park. That's a kind of reservation for the Soviet monuments in one of the parks in Moscow, the Park of Sculpture near Tretyakov Gallery. And this reservation was organized when USSR was collapsed and the monuments of old Soviet epoch were destroyed. Even the most symbolic monuments, like the monument to Felix Dzerzhinsky at the square in front of Lubyanka KGB building. And Dashevsky also depicted the construction of new monuments. There is a stone at the same square where Dzerzhinsky was previously, and there is a stone dedicated to the victims of Gulag system. The stone is named Solovki stone because Solovki was one of the largest prison camp in Gulag system on the island in Northern Sea. And in this photography you can review the combination of 2 epochs. The eye of the large poster with the portrait of Lenin on the facade of KGB building and the stone dedicated to the victims of KGB. And Dashevsky was part of the huge movement in Russia of the people who wanted to see the right judgments for their relatives who were killed, who died in Gulag system during Stalin epoch. And that's the story about Dzerzhinsky monuments at Lubyanka Square by Dashevsky. That's one of the first images in this long time story. And it was not done as a concept story. I should mark it specially. Dashevsky did the pictures at the same square for many decades, not because he had a project in his mind. He wanted to show the city life. He had a special feeling of some moments of the life. For example, here this huge shadow from the Dzerzhinsky, the first head of Lubyanka, after the revolution in Russia, and Dashevsky and his family in the shadow of this figure, as he felt in that moment. And those meeting of Dzerzhinsky and his comrade Lenin, and Dashevsky named this image the last meeting, because later the figure of Dzerzhinsky was destroyed. Solovki stone was near the same place. That's how Dashevsky felt the changes of life, how he felt Perestroika in late 80s. That's the exact same day when Dzerzhinsky monument was destroyed, as on the color image by Zemlyanichenko I already shown to you. And that's the first winter without these monuments. Only the basement at the same place, but even the basement, as you can see, partly destroyed, and the small flag of New Russia, 3-color flag on top of this basement, and later the cross of mercy was established on the same basement, but later even this temporary monument was destroyed, and right now it's just an empty square. And that is the park of sculptures with the monuments from different parts of Moscow collected in one place, the monuments of former Soviet epoch. But Dashevsky reviewed the story of the monuments in Moscow, not only of the Soviet monuments. There is, for example, the monument to Nikolai Gogol, one of the greatest Russian writers of 19th century. And Gogol is also the face of Russian satire, of Russian critique literature about power. And when this monument was under the construction, Dashevsky saw this image in 80s, and he named this image the face of Russian satire. Because in 80s to critique the power was very dangerous still. Even before Perestroika came, it was dangerous. And to have such a face for the critique even in art, that was for Dashevsky a metaphoric image of the life of those days. And that is a new monument. It was constructed in 1990s. It's a monument to Dostoevsky. Before this monument, it was no sculpture of Dostoevsky in Moscow. During the whole Soviet period, Dostoevsky was recognized, but at the same time not promoted Russian writer in Soviet system. And here it looks very unstable, even painful construction in the photography, how Dashevsky depicted the position of Dostoevsky and his literature in Russia. The back of monument of Karl Marx and the temporary figure of Charlie Chaplin at the Moscow Carnival in 1990s. The great and the funny. The mirror of the central fashion store just across the Kremlin, and one of the Kremlin towers reflected in the shop window of this central store at the Red Square with the figure from the Dior collection, the sign of new times in Russia. And the cartoon figures of the presidents at the central street of Moscow. The picture named "The Russia is Passing Away." The figures of Gorbachev and Yeltsin in that moment were fully recognized even from the back as the empty silhouettes. Of course, for us right now, we need some comments to recognize who are these figures. And the connections of the power, of the new power and the art. It's the opening ceremony for the new sculpture in Moscow, and the mayor of Moscow, in that time it was Yuri Lushkov, did a speech. And the picture named "The Poet and the Mayor." So again, about the relations between art and the state, art and the power, and the relations of real people and the monuments. This worker depicted in front of Pushkin monuments at the Pushkin Square in Moscow, and city view under the new symbol of Moscow, the monument to Peter the Great, very strangely looked on top of old Moscow picturesque buildings of 19th century. Stop. You remember this text on the top of Dzerzhinsky monument, and that's a new epoch. Stop to advertisement in the city. Stop to this new consumerism in the city. Dashevsky all his life wanted to react on the contemporary questions from the society, but it's not because he has a duty to react, but he has his own opinion, and he expresses his opinion in his photography. Thank you for attention. If you will have any questions, you can contact Russian Cultural Center our Texas in Houston, and I will be glad to answer your questions. Goodbye.